Tēnā tātou. Tēnā tātou, ko hui mai nei ki tēnei o ngā hui topa, ka timata tātou nei hui I te karakia, tēnā tātou. Tuia ki te rangi, tuia ki te papa, tuia ki te moana, tuia ki te ira tangata. E rongo te pō, e rongo te ao. Ko rangi nui ki runga, ko papa tūnuki ki raro, tūturu whakamaua ki a tina, haumi e hui e, tai.
Ai, ki.
Tēnā tātou, ko hui nei ki tēnei o ngā huinga, ko te huinga tuatoru tēnei. Welcome to you all for the third series, webinar series for He Waka Eke Noa. Please enter your questions at the end of the presentation. So you'll see a Q&A. There's two sections. There's a chat room that's just for general kōrero, but for the Q&A sessions, please put them into that section, and Leonie will monitor these and ask these to Shirley at the end of her presentation. So I'd like to pass it over to Professor Leonie Pihama to introduce our presenter for today. Tēnā koe, Leonie.
Tēnā koe, hiri aroha. Tēnā koe mo tō karakia kia whakatuwhira tō tātou hui I te aiahi nei. Huri noa I te whare, tēnā koe tō katoa ko hui mai nei tēnei wā. Tēnei te kōrero tuatoru mō tō mātou mahi rangahau, He Waka Eke Noa, nau mai, hara mai, raro mai. So welcome everyone back for the third of the series from the He Waka Eke Noa team as part of the mahi we're doing around Māori understandings and cultural frameworks to do with family violence and sexual violence prevention and intervention. It's really it's a privilege for us to be able to come back every couple of weeks and share what we can in the COVID space. We're trying to utilise the online webinar system to really get out some of the whakaaro that have come through from whānau, from Māori providers, both in terms of the qualitative work and the quantitative survey work. So today we've got Shirley Simmonds who's joining us, and Shirley has led out a number of our survey projects in the past few years, and has been the kaupapa Māori epidemiologist survey lead for He Waka Eke Noa. Shirley has a long history of being engaged in kaupapa Māori epidemiology, health research, as well as being really active in the kind of organic recycling, well-being of our whenua space for Māori, and we've been very privileged to have Shirley agree to be a part of this mahi. I'm going to leave the introduction for Shirley to do herself in terms of her pepeha, but Shirley, we just want to acknowledge your work and thank you for all that you've done in terms of this mahi, and looking forward to this session with you. Nō reira, e te tuahine, e te māreikura tēnā koe. Te a koe te wā.
Tēnā koe, Leonie, tēnā tātou katoa, tēnā koe hiri aroha nau ki tera ki tēnei hui rorohiko, he mihi nui ki a koutou katoa e hui mai nei, e aro mai nei, ki tēnei ahi ahi. He uri tēnei o te waka o tainui, ko raukaua ki te whakaoroa Pātikiri te iwi, ko Ngāti Huri te hapu, ko te tū, kei te wao tū, ke marae, ki te taha kaki kuia, he uri hoki o ngā puhi, ko manga muka te marae. Nō reira, ko tēnei au, Shirley Simmonds, mi ana kia koutou katoa. Thank you for that introduction, Leonie, and yes, apart from this mahi, you've kind of alluded to one of my other passions, and that's gardening and composting. And I'm also a mother of two young boys. Yeah, my key focus, my main focus, I guess, is kaupapa in terms of mahi and working towards our aims and aspirations as Māori. It's been a real pleasure and always a learning experience working on this kaupapa alongside Leonie, Hiri Aroha and the wider team. So I do want to acknowledge all the mahi that's been done here and the previous two presentations in the last few weeks. So in terms of today's kōrero, I'll bring up my slides just now. There we go. It's a bit disconcerting not being able to see anybody except ourselves, but Katie fine. So in terms of our kōrero today, I'm going to talk to the survey portion of the wider project. The survey sought to gather some more quantitative data to supplement the kōrero that has been provided by the community consultation and interviews. It provides another dimension, I guess, to the data that's gathered, and hopefully overall, or the intention is overall, adds to that richness of information gathered in this research project. The overall aims of the survey and the study overall, I guess, is to investigate the role of culture in violence prevention and intervention. So the survey itself sought to collect data from up to 1,000 respondents on violence on both the collective, so violence on us as Māori, on whānau, and on the individual, our individual experiences and perspectives of violence. We sought data of violence. We had questions around violence perpetuated by individuals, but also violence from the state and violence from media. Questions around avenues for support, either support you sought yourself and amongst your community or family, or seeking services for support. We included in there, because of the timing of the survey, questions around the impact of COVID-19 lockdowns. We wondered and wanted to investigate whether there is a difference in levels of violence during the lockdown periods in particular. And we asked respondents around strategies for minimizing impact of violence in their lives and then that of their whānau, and also health and wellbeing aspirations of respondents. So the group that we surveyed were adults aged 18 and over, resident in Aotearoa at the time of the survey, and those who identify as Māori, both ethnicity and in terms of whakapapa Māori as well. So we took the two definitions. And the survey was distributed as an online survey and largely through promotion and through existing networks that we had to get the survey out there. Yeah, and I do want to at this point, so we've got around 1,600 responses, which I think is a lot, and do want to pause a moment to acknowledge that. I think at this time in particular during the pandemic, you know, there are a lot of pressures on our whānau. I think that fact itself speaks to how important it is for our whānau to be heard on this kaupapa. In the survey we took, and I've put definition there in inverted commas, but it's not technically a definition, but in terms of identifying the types of violence, we looked at quite a broad definition, broad view. So, and our broad view of violence includes both experiencing and witnessing violence. So our definition, if you like, saw witnessing violence as a form of violence itself. And included also violence on the individual. So this could be, questions were around psychological, emotional deprivation, sexual violence, physical violence, financial abuse, online violence, and denigration of whakapapa. In terms of our view or definition of state violence, our questioning was around neglect, failure to protect by services, abuse and abuse of power, racism, experiences of breaches of te tiriti, and also police violence. Oops, too fast. So in terms of the data presented today, we're focusing at this point, largely on the state violence section of the survey. Just in the interest of time, there's quite a lot of data in the survey, and I think it's really good to look at them separately so we can pause and reflect on individual results and the impact of them. In terms of the survey methods, we used a pie order framework based on He Koro Wai Oranga, the Māori Health Strategy, and we used the top part of the Māori Health Strategy to form our framework. So in the top sort of peak of He Koro Wai Oranga, we have at the top peak, pie order or healthy futures, aspirational healthy futures for Māori. Then also wai order, whānau order, and mauri order. We'll look at those. So this equated to 5 sections in the survey, including the first section, which are our demographic section, demographic information. Whānau order, this refers to experiences of the collective or whānau and communities. Mauri order, the experiences of individual, and wai order. Wai order here talks about healthy environments, and we've taken the definition of environment to include the systems and access to support, either in the community and amongst family or networks, or services, health services and social services and so on. And the final section we included in the survey was that of aspirational wellbeing, asking questions around what are your visions for health. So some of the results in terms of the demographics of the survey, as I mentioned before, we got a large number of responses. The survey was left open for approximately 6 months online, and as I mentioned before, circulated via email and through promotional networks to reach our whānau. So there are pros and cons to online surveys. One of them that they're not kanohi ki te kanohi, but also that one of the benefits is that can easily be accessed by those who have access to technology. But again, another con, if you like, is that not everyone has access to technology. So we need to be kind of conscious of some of these limitations of the survey. Another point to note is that of the responses, approximately 80% were female, 17% male, and 4% chose to self-describe their gender identity in their own words. So a point to note here is that a large proportion, and the majority in fact, were female. So this survey results represent largely the voice of our female respondents. And I think this points to perhaps the need to investigate similar kind of responses from furthermore from male respondents and those who choose to self-describe their identity in other ways. So just a point to note in that respect. The age range is between 18 and 87 years old, and the median age was 49. So that's quite a good spread in terms of age. Most of the responses were from spread across Aotearoa, quite concentrated in the North Island, which is probably also reflective of a high proportion of Māori in the North Island. So in terms of results, I'm going to present 5 or 6 slides here with some graphs and data on it, and some of the initial results, just for, as I mentioned earlier, state experiences of state violence. One of the first questions was, and it asks about lifetime experience, and you'll note also in the question, it asks about both you and your whānau. So in your lifetime, have you or your whānau experienced neglect? And I guess the rationale around asking you or your whānau is, the thinking that what impacts our whānau impacts us. So we've been inclusive in the questions in that respect. In your lifetime, have you or your whānau experienced neglect, such as denial of access to social services from the state or government agencies? In terms of responses, and these are slightly color coded. So the darker ones are a lot, medium blue, if you like, a few times, and the light blue never, and that's consistent throughout this data. So effectively, the light and dark areas are those who responded yes. We have experienced neglect from state or government agencies. Those who said a lot, around 21%, and those who stated a few times, around 46%. So the flip side of that is only, approximately a third stated they have never experienced neglect from state or government agencies. A further question asked, which agencies did you experience this level of neglect? Respondents were allowed to pick more than one, and the knowledge that they would have encountered more than one agency. And the answers are here in order of the highest number of responses. So the one that received the highest number of responses is the health system, followed by WINS, followed by education, police, and the justice system. For this question and the following questions, we've provided a list that we generated from research and knowledge and consultation as to which services might be indicated by respondents here. But we also provided a space for respondents to say other, and other. So what came up quite often in the other section was ACC. So I haven't put the numbers here for that, but that's just a point to note at this point. The next question, in your lifetime, have you or your whānau experienced failure to protect, which is similar but different to neglect, by the state or government agencies? The responses were 17% yes, a lot, 47%, so almost a half, yes, a few times, and just over a third that stated never. The state or government agencies indicated here were first up police, health system, justice system, education, and WINS. Third question in this area on state violence. In your lifetime, have you or your whānau experienced abuse or abuse of power from the state or government agencies? 22, approximately 23% stated yes, a lot. Approximately half stated yes, a few times, and 28% stated never. In terms of abuse or abuse of power, the state or government agencies indicated here were police, health, justice system, education, and oranga tamariki. So just a point to note about these responses here is it's very dependent on the respondent having an interaction with those agencies. So for example, if some of those that stated never might have never had an interaction with the police. So it's kind of dependent on whether they have had an interaction or not. Just a point to note in terms of interpreting the data. In your lifetime, have you or your whānau experienced racism from the state or government agencies? And you see this graph looks quite different from those before because there's a larger number that stated yes, they have a lot. So over a third stated yes, we have experienced racism a lot from the state or government agencies. Almost half stated a few times. So that's a large majority that stated yes, we've experienced racism. And a small proportion, 17% approximately, stated that we have never experienced racism from the state or government. The agencies indicated here, which is interesting, it's a slightly different order to those we've seen previously. By which of the following: education, health, police, WINS, and the justice system? In your lifetime, have you or your whānau experienced breaches of te tiriti or waitangi from the state or government agencies? Again, a large majority stated yes, we have, and a lot, like approximately 44%. approximately 40%, just under 40% stated yes a few times, and a considerably smaller proportion stated they have never experienced breaches of TTVT or Waka, approximately 17%. Again, a point to note is that this question requires respondents to recognise a breach of TTVT or Waka. So that's something to think about in terms of interpreting data. They may happen, these breaches may happen, and we might not recognise them. And a slightly different list here too to that has come up before. So by which of the following in terms of breaches of TTVT? Customs and Immigration, District or Regional Council, Department of Conservation, Education and Health. In your lifetime, have you or your whānau experienced police violence? And again, a point to note, this question is dependent on those having contact with the police. Just under 9% said yes, a lot. 43% said yes a few times. So that's about half, and about just under half, 48% stated they had never experienced police violence. This is a general question. In general, how much does state or system violence impact on your well-being? And the order of questions was deliberate. We've required respondents to think more closely about their experiences of state or system violence, and then ask overall impact on your well-being. And again, quite compelling, approximately 80% stated, that yes, it did, either a lot or some. 32% stated state or system violence impacts on my well-being, a lot. Just under half said it does somewhat. And then just under 20% stated state or system violence doesn't impact on our well-being. So that's the key results in terms of the questions around state or system violence in our survey. And I just thought it's quite a lot of data, but I thought it would be good to pause a moment and think, any of those results surprising in terms of the numbers of the proportions that have been indicated here in the survey, also in terms of the state or system services that were indicated in the responses. So any surprising results? And we haven't looked at this data yet, but the survey also then went on to ask, are there things you try to do to minimize violence in your life? Then we asked for a yes, no, and then please describe either yes or no. So just again, a moment to think, what do you think might be some of the responses in terms of strategies to minimize violence in your life? What might be some of these strategies, or what might have been some of the responses? And what could the impact be of some of these strategies that whānau and individuals are implementing in order to minimize the impact of violence in your life? So in the response to this question, we left an open text box in the survey where respondents could just freely write what their thoughts were or what their strategies were. This generated a lot of data, but at a level of richness that you don't get with the sort of yes, no tick box questions that we normally have in a survey. In this slide, we've got sort of a preliminary analysis of that data. It is at this point, very once over likely. As I mentioned, there's quite a depth of data there we've yet to dive right into. But even at this point, some of the responses that whānau gave to this question are quite telling, quite compelling. So the question was, as I mentioned, are there things you do to try and minimize violence in your life? quite a common one was disengagement with services. For example, some of my whānau have given up applying for income support. So in this section, there were comments around, you know, I don't go into the health system unless I really, really need to. It's disengaged. And if we think about the ongoing, you know, the follow-on impacts of that, is that our whānau are likely not availing themselves of the services that they're entitled to. Another strategy was adherence to rules and laws. I keep my nose clean. You know, making sure we adhere to rules and laws, keep out of trouble, and this minimize or limits risk of engagement with, for example, the justice system. Another strategy was around education and system navigation. So I educate myself and my whānau on what we are entitled to, what we are entitled to. This came up quite often, that individuals and whānau would research and look into their entitlements or ways in which they can better navigate the system, whether it be health system or education system or justice, for example. Advocacy and support in this instance. Take trustworthy people with you. Another example, you know, take a whānau member when I go to the health system. So ensuring that we have support, somebody who's trusted to go along with our engagements with the system. Self-advocacy, I exercise my rights, I know my rights, and use of complaints. Another theme that came up was whānau seeking their own healing, and largely through tikanga or connection. This came up a lot. So for some examples, I try to connect with my hapu. Ka mau tonu ahau kia ku tikanga me tōku reo. So if, you know, seeking healing in our tikanga and our reo. Karakia came up quite often. Other things that came up were, for example, kapahaka, waka ama. So there was a fair amount of evidence of our whānau seeking healing as a counteract to violence in their life, to minimise the impact of violence in life, seeking that through tikanga Māori and connectivity. A lot of it talked about reconnecting with hapu or whānau and marae. And a further theme, rangatiratanga, live on our whenua with our rules. I thought that was quite a good one to sum up the section. It says a lot. So as I mentioned, this is very much a initial analysis of that data. There's a lot of data in there, but really key, I think it's one of the key aims of this overall research project. Oh. So I guess just to sum up, this was purely just the section that questioned survey, and in the survey on state violence, on experiences of state violence. We've tried to take a broad view of what state violence is and how it can manifest. So included things like breaches of te tiriti and experiences of racism. And the questioning has been around lifetime experience, but lifetime experience not only of yourself, but that of your whānau. So if you've heard of your whānau having an experience, for example, with the justice system, then that, you know, you're in a position in the survey to answer from that perspective. And then to follow, at the end of that section, we've summed up with things that respondents might try and do to minimise violence in your life. And the survey is seeking solutions, if you like, particularly ones that whānau and communities come up with ourselves. I might hand it back over to Leonie at this point, if there are any comments or questions, or anything that Leonie might want to add.
Kia ora, Shirley. So, I mean, there's an opportunity for some Q&A. If anyone has any partai, please just put them into the Q&A section. I guess one of the things around the survey that we were really clear about was ensuring that we got the multi-layers of the impact of violence on our people, and beginning with looking at state violence was a really important component of the work, and it really follows on from the task force report that was done around whānau violence, that really looked at the implications of colonisation, the implications of state violence, the implications of community violence, and the implications of an impact of whānau violence. So beginning this part of the webinar series, looking at the state violence component, is about kind of contextualising that wider understanding of colonisation and the wider understanding of the current experiences that many of our whānau have within the system, and being very clear about that interrelatedness between the kind of system structural issues and the impact on whānau and individuals within whānau. So I guess what we will do for those of you who are watching is that as we get the next layer of data, Shirley will come back on and do a number of other webinars that relate to the collective at a community level. So we'll see in terms of, and one of the questions that came up, and rightfully so, kind of related to whenua, we see organisations like DOC appearing, regional councils appearing, and those organisations come up quite significantly in the community when we're looking at the kind of hapori or the closer kind of local community impact. But I just want to grab a couple of these questions, Shirley, for you. First of all, did you include domestic violence in the research survey? So do you want to talk a little bit about where that sits?
Yes, absolutely. So, and you might remember our framework included a section on Mauri Ora, which is an individual experience of violence. We have included a section on that, and as Leonie mentioned, we'll present that in a block in a later date. One of the things we didn't include was a question around perpetrator. So who perpetrated the violence? We had considered diving more into who did the violence, but we decided not to. That's, I think, at a survey level, yeah, we need to be cautious that we're only getting one level of data, and asking deeper questions around who perpetuated the violence could be misrepresented. So the results of that could be misrepresented. So we were wary of asking questions around that. But to answer your question, we have included domestic violence on individuals, and that'll be presented at another day.
Yeah, so just in terms of that question, that will be coming up as we delve in. And inside of that, part of the survey is also a section around people's experiences during COVID. And as Shirley said, the timing of it, as we were, coming into the COVID experience in Aotearoa, it meant that we felt obliged to put something around that. And so that will be coming up shortly, and we'll keep everyone up to date with that. So Lizzie's asked, anecdotally, I would imagine that if there was a higher level of te tiriti understanding, the response about breaches would be 100%. So what's your judgment, or what's your whakaaro, I guess, around that?
Yeah, absolutely, totally. And like I mentioned in presenting that data, this requires an understanding or a recognition of what a breach of te tiriti is. I think a couple of things similar with racism, and we know racism can happen at a structural level, but also at an interpersonal level. I think for us as we navigate our daily lives, breaches and both breaches and a racism that we experience at an interpersonal level are more readily recognised than structural racism or structural breaches that happen at a structural level. I agree with your statement that the response would be about 100%. The other thing that's of interest is in some of the open-ended responses that asked around strategies for minimising the impact of violence, a number of people stated things like, I'm white passing, so I don't experience violence as much, or I don't experience racism as much. So a lot of people, a number of respondents talked about that, or and this was actually one that a response that I find really aroha to hear, I pretend I'm not Māori. So in that way, that affords, I guess, a level of protection from these experiences if individuals are, as they state, white passing.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Shirley, to make, because I think that in that open text question, it really was for us, because we don't want to get into this notion that we just take this, right? And that we don't have any level of resistance to it, because in the answers we see that there are multiple layers of resistance that our whānau do and that our people do in many, many contexts. And some of them are survival mechanisms, purely survival mechanisms around those kinds of interactions that are had, and others are absolute assertions of rangatiratanga or assertions of kaupapa Māori, or a reaffirmation of advocacy. So there is a lot around advocacy, both in terms of seeking advocates in Māori organisations and whānau and friends and people who know the system, but also, Shirley, you talked a little bit about self-advocacy that people, do you want to talk a little bit about those kind of replies, the kind of self-advocacy that people do for their own well-being?
And that's an interesting one, because my personal view is it takes another level of energy to have the energy. For example, if you've had a negative experience with, say, the health system, it takes another level of energy to then sit down and write a letter of complaint, or advocate in that way. But having said that, a number of people stated that they did use letters of complaint as a way to advocate, self-advocate, and hopefully change or impact the system themselves. And I know from other research that we've been involved in order to navigate the system, it requires that level of self-advocacy. And just as some of those have mentioned, learning how the system works in order to be able to navigate the system, whether it's health or education or otherwise, and use whānau support and information gathered from whānau and share it with whānau. So some of them talked about, I learn the system and then I teach my kids, so that then the kids are empowered to then navigate the system. So in that respect, we've sort of termed that, those kind of responses, as self-advocacy. Taking it, it's another level of sort of assertion of your rights in that respect, I think.
So we have another partai here from MB Lynn. Have you, or are you planning to break down the results in terms of male, females, self-described gender responses, or are there not enough numbers?
Yeah, good question again. We weren't sure at the outset that we would, because we got 1,600 responses. I do believe that we could break it down by males and females, but possibly we only got sort of 4% that identify, self-described their own gender identity. That wouldn't be enough numbers to generate statistically robust data. So certainly by males and females.
I guess we can add to that reply too, is that the work with Te Whāriki Takapo and Alison Green and others that we've done recently, the survey around Takatapui and Māori LGBTQI wellbeing survey, also has questions in it around the impact of racism and the ways in which services have provided or not provided, access to wellbeing. And so I think that's for MB Lanya, that's one maybe you could have a look on the Te Whānau Ki Takapau page and look at that survey as well. And when we're discussing these, I think we'll be looking at that survey as well. I think the other survey too that's significant is the one done around racism by Te Whao Te Ao that was published last year, I believe. And when we look at the figures of racism, the impact of racism and tenancy breaches that we're looking at, which are kind of around the 83-84% mark, right, Shirley, that people had experienced. And the Te Whao Te Ao survey, those Māori who experienced racism was similarly around the kind of 90 to 93% of all Māori had experienced some form of racism, both personal and institutional racism. So what we will be doing, particularly around the Takatapu, is actually look into the Honour Project survey as well in our conversations. Adina has said, this is really important data. How do you aim to use the data toward intervention?
Yeah, and you might have some more kōrero on this, Leonie. One of the overall aims of the project was to look at cultural frameworks for intervention, how our tikanga, our reo, our traditional processes and tupuna teachings provide us with the solutions to today's challenges in our colonial context. I think that's the sort of mindset and the framework that's underlying the research as a whole, and it's, I think, one of the key things that we want to highlight. This can help, I think, advocate for, support for some of those services. Some tikanga, tikanga Māori providers and services, like I mentioned before, some things that were talked about were kapahaka, waka ama, access to reo, access to tikanga, reconnecting with marae. I think those are really key results that can help orientate services and advocate for, further supporting us to have access to what we're entitled to, what we have rights to, our own tikanga reo. You might have some more thoughts on that.
Yeah. Yes, and a lot of the development of the survey came from Māori providers who really already know this stuff and have seen the many services and systems that have impacted in neglectful ways and abusive ways. The fact that Oranga Tamariki jumps up from somewhere else into the abuse of power should not be a surprise to us. The fact that regional councils come in around tenancy breaches should not be a surprise to us. There is a key grouping that really kind of sit in those top 5 or 6 that continually come up. But depending on the focus, there are other organisations that kind of come to the fore more clearly. And so one of the things that we were asked by Māori providers who are working with us, particularly Tutu Moehingi o Taranaki and Te Puna Oranga and Te Waipounamu, was to, this is a kind of evidence-based to support the discussion and arguments around the impact of systemic racism, abuse, violence on our people. And again, aligning to the Kruger report where, whānau violence is also, it's not just about the violence between and amongst whānau, but it's that perpetuated on whānau by systems and institutions and agencies and the Crown. So a lot of what we're doing is bringing together some of that evidence base to support the arguments back and the arguments for kaupapa Māori systems, kaupapa Māori developments, te Waitangi partnerships at multiple levels. So I think that there are a whole range of intervention ways. So we've got Marlon Elkington, and Marlon, and I see as identified, so I've scrolled back up, Marlon works in disability. Is there any information gathered around the abuse for Māori with a disability? So that we did have the disability question in the survey, Shirley, but we haven't gone into that as yet in terms of individuals, or?
I'm actually trying to think now. I don't think we had one specifically with disability. So that's a really good point, and that's an area that I think is under research. It's really good that that's raised.
So I do know, Marlon, that in the honour project with Te Whānake Takapai, there is a specific question related to the impact in terms of Two-Spirit, in terms of Māori LGBTQI and Takatapui, with, you know, in the disability sector and with disability and that impact. So if you want to email us at any point, and we can go back through what we have and maybe have a conversation with you, Marlon, around further supporting the work that you're doing. So from H. Muriwai, it would have been interesting but predictable perhaps to have a control group of tauiwi.
Yeah, another good question. This survey was deliberately orientated towards Māori, and I guess a couple of rationale points in there. One is that there hasn't been a survey conducted like this around violence at this level of depth, if you like, just for Māori. So we were very interested in generating that data. The other thing is, and you might appreciate from the nature of the questions, we could orientate the questions specifically to a Māori context. So they ask around questions around the collective, which is quite a different context to that for tauiwi. It also allows us to ask around things like experiences of racism, so racism in the context specifically of being Māori, and questions around breaches of te reti or waitangi. But yeah, I agree, quite likely the results would be predictable if we were able to compare these questions between Māori and non-Māori in terms of negative experiences or experiences of violence from the state. But yeah, it was deliberately orientated for Māori.
Yeah, we did from the very beginning have a clear focus of it being on Māori, but it is a good question. From an anonymous attendee, other than that, your kiti behind you look fantastic. Which 6 months was the survey open, and at a later date will you be presenting on whānau experience of state violence and how that affect experiences of individual and domestic violence?
Yeah, the 6 months that the survey was open were March to September last year to 2021, and so if we cast our mind back to then, you know, we were sort of, well, we still maybe are, but in the midst of the pandemic. So the question, which we haven't presented today, but around experiences either side of the lockdowns are really relevant. And that's also the reason why we asked about lifetime experience rather than what a survey will often do is ask about your experience in the past year. Under the assumption that our experiences in the past year of like everything are different. So they wouldn't be reflective of overall experiences of Māori in terms of violence. What was the other question, I think? Oh yeah, and that's a good question too. So your question was around, can we sort of cross over, you know, those who said they had experiences of state violence with those who had experiences of domestic violence. We wouldn't have the numbers to be able to cross that over, but I think that would be good for us. Well, I think we wouldn't have the numbers. I think we'll try and have a look at that. I think that's a good question. Because we sort of know in terms of context, the ongoing effect of violence. So, you know, those who experience violence can sometimes also perpetuate violence and so on. So if we're experiencing violence of the state, how does that impact our experiences as an individual? So I think that would be interesting to look at. It remains to be seen if we have the numbers enough to sort of cross over that data.
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting question around that kind of impact of the structural violence and how that plays out in our interpersonal relationships. And given the high numbers of people that have experienced state violence have varying, if we're looking at the racism and the tenancy breaches, we're looking at the mid 80% of our people, which then reduces the number that haven't experienced any form of state violence. But it's definitely something that we can note, Bernie and Hiri Aroha, to look at when we go into those other layers of the data analysis. Elaine has asked, did whānau identify protective factors? I guess that there may be some some overlap, with the reduction of violence strategies.
Yeah, I think some of the responses in the open-ended question, strategies to minimise, I guess some of these could be viewed as protective factors. I think what is interesting, and just thinking of that particular question, so respondents were asked, do you have strategies to minimise the impact of violence? Yes or no? And then if yes, what were they? No, elaborate sort of. So they gave open-ended responses for both. But what I found interesting was often the responses were the same. So people will say, no, I don't have any strategies, I just keep to myself. So that kind of is really similar to, yes, I have a strategy, I keep my nose clean. So I found that quite interesting. It may have been the nature of our questioning, but I think it also speaks to how this does serve to shape our lives in many ways, and we may or may not recognize it. Some of these strategies have become very automated in our lives.
We did do that. We did. I think that definitely, Elaine, in those reduction of violence strategies in terms of the state, I think there's some really clear protective strategies, and even if it's I comply, some people said things like, I've learned to live with the injustice, or I just stop interacting. So those things, but then there are others that are very clear about their advocacy, clear about who they go to. And I guess that kind of goes into Emily's question around, is there much difference in the numbers of people using their own whānau and friends versus services that provide people, support people as a strategy to minimise violence? And I guess we haven't, that's the digging down in these numbers that we haven't gone into so much yet, but we will. Who do people turn to? But we know from a general overview that there are many people that do seek advocacy. So have you seen a difference in your reading over of that? The text answers?
Difference in numbers of people
who go to whānau and those that go to organisations.
Yeah. My sense would be that a lot go to whānau, and not so much services, but that would just be a sense, not a strict, reading over the results, not a strict statistical analysis. And it might be that, whānau are our sort of first port of call. We have access to whānau and that sort of advice, and it might be that we do that before we go to services, but it also might be that it, negates the need for services if we seek our solutions or answers in amongst our whānau and community context.
So we can take note of that as well, to look at the text answers and to look at where people go to for advocacy in terms of organisations. So Cindy Kalwana has asked, is there data on violence by mainstream NGOs? I think there's probably more happening not only to whānau receiving the service, but also against the kaimahi working in the service, which is an excellent.
Yeah, and another good question. So we haven't really distinguished, if you experience violence from a service, we haven't really distinguished, were you a recipient of the service or were you staff employed by the service? But in the free text answers, some of them have stated things like, I left because of this. So that indicates they were employed by a service and recognise or experience something like racism or some sort of violence. But the questions weren't set up to sort of distinguish the position of the respondents themselves. So yeah, and that is a really good point. I think we need to, I just think to some of my other work in the area of health, ensuring the safety of our kaimahi Māori in the health service amongst their peers, as well as, from protection or safety in terms of the system itself. And, we do need to think of violence in a similar way we need to think of racism and so on, both at a, horizontal violence, vertical violence, and all the different dimensions that it can happen. So that's a really good point to raise.
So Lizzie's asked, it would be interesting to see if there's any link between specific reduction strategies, e.g. strong links with whānau hapu or karakia, and violence experience. So this again is that kind of looking across people's experience of violence and what they're doing to strategize to minimize violence, right?
Yeah, and that's another, so again, this survey wasn't designed to do that. That would require something like asking a number of questions of a person to see, to try and sort of determine their strength of connection, existing strength of connection with whānau hapu, iwi, marae, and so on, and their experience of violence, is it greater or lesser? And that's quite a tricky thing to dig down into at a survey level. It kind of requires making almost a judgment on people's strength of connection with marae and hapu and so on. But it would be interesting, that might be something that would best be looked at in qualitative interviews. Really. Yeah.
And I think as we begin to dig down more deeply into the data and look at the ways in which people are looking at are strategizing for themselves and their whānau to reduce violence, we will see some information, but we're not necessarily going to be able to make any kind of statistical or quantitative comment on it. But I think that what we have in even just in terms of the reducing or minimizing violence from the state, there are a number of people that speak to turning to whānau, turning to strengthen themselves and their whānau in terms of tikanga, opting out of the system in a rangatiratanga way, not necessarily in a conforming way. So there's just so many layers of it. And what we did want to do, Shirley, right, in terms of taking a kaupapa Māori approach to the survey, was ensure that we got that too, and we weren't sitting entirely in the kind of, this is what we experience of the violence, but we also wanted to really hear people's kōrero around their strategies. And so all the way through, there are these text responses that do that, right?
Yeah, and I didn't talk to it too much just in the interest of time, but this survey was very much a kaupapa Māori survey, and we sort of, we would do a mini wānanga on every one of the survey steps. And so one of the things that's traditionally done in the survey, you try and limit the amount of free text answers because that generates a lot of statistical analysis. But taking a kaupapa Māori approach, we wanted respondents to have that, I guess, freedom and opportunity to have their say and freedom of voice. So we did put in a number of the open-end questions in the knowledge that it would require a whole lot more analysis. But as I mentioned at the outset, that's provided us in many ways the depth and the richness of the data.
I guess too, it's important to kind of say that we saw this survey as a beginning. It's not an ending, like as a beginning kind of baseline survey that, and even just just from the questions, and the points raised, say by Marlon, by Elaine, Cindy, and Lizzie, and others, that there are all of these other areas that need more exploration. And so what we're trying to do is just kind of give some baseline, and hopefully that will, you know, support others to be doing the in-depth work that they need to be doing in the areas that they want to focus in. So the question around something like mainstream NGOs, yes, providers have been very clear, and yes, there are some comments around leaving organisations, but actually in this particular survey, we were more focused on state and the government and kāwanatanga violence in terms of, and so, you know, there's this whole other area for work to be done specifically on the impact of these questions too, specific to Māori that are differently able or experience disability or cut out of the system, or, you know, are in NGOs, or all of those components that need a lot more work done. And so we're hoping the survey will just be a start, and we see it as a starting point, not an end point, right?
It can be a good indicator for where further research is specifically needed.
So I'm just cognizant of the time, and I know that people have, you know, put aside this hour. So Shirley, if there's anything that you'd like to say, you know, to close this part, he mihi nui kia koe mai mahi mo kōrero I tēnei wā, nā mihi nui kia koe mo kaha ki te manaaki, ki te tautoko tēnei kaupapa I ngā wā katoa, ara ko te kaupapa Māori, tēnei te mihi atu kia koe. So if you've got any closing whakaaro you want to share, and then we'll hand it to Here Aroha to do our karakia.
Kia ora. No, I just, he mihi nui kia koutou, ko pai, mai nei, aroruhiko tēnei ahi. Do really appreciate the questions that have come forward. This really helps us scrutinize the data. So do just want to really acknowledge your attention this afternoon, and the questions that have come forth. It's not always an easy platform, so do appreciate that. Just want to say take a moment to say, he mihi nui kia koutou. I'll hand over to you, Peter.
Here Aroha kei a koe te wā.
Tēnā tātou, tēnā koe te tuakana e Shirley, mō te tirohanga whānui, mō inei mahi o te raraunga, tēnei te mihi atu kia koe o te rakorua kuleone. Just before we finish off, there are some, I'm just going to share my screen so that we can give you some directions into where to get further information, and also where to get the all the, can you see the screen? So here's some web links to Ngā Waiata Tui Māori and Indigenous research, and those, so if you want to pull a photo out and take a photo, this will be the link to where all the presentation series will be loaded. So already there says series 1 with Professor Linda Tuhiwai, series 2 with Professor Leonie Pihama, and then this series 3 will be loaded up in the next couple of days. So here are the links if you want to go and watch the other series, and this will be the same link to the further series, which we have quite a few lined up. So I just wanted to share that before we close off. And I'll just leave it there for a couple more seconds so you can take a photo of that. Hoi anō, tēnei te mihi atu, kia koutou ka whakakapita tātou nei, hui topa tēnā tātou. Hikitia te rongo mai whiti o tēnei huihuinga mō te kaupapa o he waka ekenua, toka kia ia, toka kia oi, kura minui ki runga, ko papatūna ki raro, tūturu whakamaua kia tina, haumi e hui e, tai ki. Tēnā tātou.